The starfield glittered with cold indifference as David's ship streaked through the void, leaving trails of stardust in its wake. He had been on countless missions, seen the way light bent around black holes and watched suns flare into supernovas. Space had been his constant companion, a vast, unfathomable sea where he could lose himself in the silence. But this time, that silence turned sinister. The navigational systems flashed warnings in shades of crimson, a relentless beeping that echoed through the cockpit. An unseen force gripped his ship, pulling it off course with an impossible gravity. "Damn it," he muttered, yanking at the controls, but his fingers slipped over the touchscreen panels. The readings made no sense. He was far from any known gravitational fields, far from any charted planets, yet the ship was spinning into a nosedive. The last thing he saw before impact was the emerald glow of an uncharted world rushing up to meet him. David awoke to a searing pain shooting through his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His ship was a crumpled ruin half buried in the alien soil, steam rising from the overheated engines. Around him stretched a landscape of jagged mountains, their peaks shrouded in swirling mist, with skies that pulsed a deep, unnatural green. He struggled to his feet, wincing as he surveyed the damage. The comm system was fried beyond repair, his supplies scattered across the rocky terrain. "Just perfect," he muttered, kicking at a charred panel. He looked up at the strange sky, trying to get his bearings, but all he saw was the unfamiliar constellations that blinked down mockingly. He had survived worse asteroid collisions, space pirates, solar flares, but this? Being stranded on an uncharted, hostile planet was a death sentence. Yet even as he scowled, a shiver crawled up his spine. He had the unsettling feeling of being watched. He turned, scanning the shadowy crags that surrounded him. Something moved in the distance, just a flicker against the green mist. Before he could react, a wave of nausea washed over him, and his vision swam. An unseen force pressed down on him, like the weight of a dozen hands against his skull, and the world blurred around the edges. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as alien whispers slithered through his mind. "Rest, David. You are needed." He fought against the invading thoughts, gritting his teeth, but they only grew louder. His vision darkened, and the last thing he felt was the sensation of being lifted, his body floating weightlessly, as if he were suspended in the void. David woke in a place that defied understanding. He was in a grand, vaulted chamber carved from a single piece of crystalline stone, the walls shimmering with hues of violet and silver. He lay on a platform draped with fabric that felt like spun light. Above him, the ceiling arched into infinity, a kaleidoscope of stars and nebulas shifting like living art. A group of figures surrounded him, their forms haloed in a pale blue glow. Each of them bore a distinct, ethereal beauty, skin in shades of opalescent pearl or dusky lavender, with eyes that shone like molten gold. They stood tall and graceful, their presence commanding. Despite their differences, a strange unity bound them, a shared aura of authority. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Her face was sharp, angular, with skin the color of deep obsidian, her eyes burning with the intensity of a supernova. Her voice rang out, not through sound but through the very fibers of David's mind, causing him to recoil instinctively. "I am Lyreth, High Chancellor of the Galactic Women's Tribunal. You have been brought before us by design, David of Earth." David struggled to sit up, but an invisible force held him down, a gentle yet unyielding pressure. His mouth was dry, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anger. He tried to speak, but his words dissolved into silence before they could form. "Why? What do you want with me?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse with the effort. He could feel Lirath's gaze piercing into him, stripping away the barriers of language and thought. "You possess a rare gift, Earthman," she replied, her voice weaving through his thoughts like a silken thread. "Your genes hold a resilience unmatched by any of our species, a resilience that could ensure our survival. The time has come for a new lineage, one that merges your strength with our legacy." David's heart pounded in his chest, a wave of heat surging through him. He strained against the invisible bonds holding him, anger giving him strength. "You think I'm just going to what? Help you breed a new species? I'm not some genetic donor. Let me go, or I swear." Lyreth's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Your defiance is expected, but it changes nothing. You have been chosen, David. Your role is not a request, it is a necessity." As if responding to a silent command, the pressure holding him in place eased, and David fell forward, catching himself on the edge of the platform. He glared up at Lyrath and the other tribunal members, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly at the mercy of forces beyond his control. "Let me leave," he growled, his voice a low snarl. "I have no part in your plans." Lyrath's expression softened, but her eyes remained unyielding. "In time you will understand. Until then you will remain in our care." She gestured with a slender hand, and two figures stepped forward, a woman with silvery skin that rippled like mercury, and another with hair that flowed like molten copper. David felt their touch against his mind, a gentle probing that sent shivers down his spine. As they guided him from the chamber, he glanced back at the High Chancellor, her form blending into the shimmering walls. There was a look in her eyes, a hint of something he couldn't quite place. Pity, perhaps, or a resigned acceptance of what lay ahead. It filled him with a chill deeper than the cold of space. David's new quarters were a paradox, luxurious, yet inescapable. He found himself in a spacious chamber with a window that overlooked the planet's strange, swirling landscapes. He could see the jagged mountains, the emerald mist that hugged the valleys, and a sky filled with constellations that he had never seen before. It might have been beautiful, but all he could think of was the cage it represented. The bed was soft, the air filled with a faint floral scent that soothed his senses despite his anger. An array of food and drink, none of which he recognized, was laid out on a table of translucent crystal. He ignored it, pacing the length of the room, running his hands along the smooth, cool walls, searching for a way out. There was none. For hours he tried everything he could think of, prying at seams in the crystalline walls, testing the strength of the windows, even attempting to decipher the alien symbols on the touch panels embedded in the walls. All his efforts were met with failure. Eventually exhausted, he sank into a chair near the window, watching the strange green sky turn darker, streaked with ribbons of silver light. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Who were these women really? Why him? And more urgently, how could he escape this nightmare? A soft knock echoed through the chamber, followed by the gentle creak of the door. David turned sharply, his muscles tensing as a figure stepped inside. She moved with a grace that seemed almost fluid, her skin a deep blue, like the heart of a glacier. Her eyes, a shade lighter than her skin, fixed on him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "I am Shara," she said, her voice like a soft melody in his mind. "I am to be your guide." David met her gaze with defiance, his jaw clenched. "Guide me? Guide me where?" "To your future," David, Shara replied, her expression enigmatic. She stepped closer, and he could feel the hum of her presence in his thoughts, the gentle pressure of her mind brushing against his. "There is much you do not understand, but I will show you." David felt his anger waver, momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of curiosity. Despite everything, there was something in Shara's eyes, an echo of sadness, perhaps, or regret. He sensed that she was not entirely at ease with her role in this. "Then start explaining," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, "because right now all I see are jailers with fancy powers." Shara held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, David, but know this: whether you accept it or not, your fate is now intertwined with ours. And in time you may find that the threads binding us are stronger than you imagine." As the shadows of night deepened outside the window, David felt a chill settle in his chest. He might have been stranded on an alien world, surrounded by forces beyond his comprehension, but he was far from beaten. He would learn their secrets, find their weaknesses, and somehow he would find a way back to the stars. But as he met Shara's steady gaze, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that his path forward might be more twisted than he could ever anticipate. The days that followed were a blur of alien architecture, strange customs, and deeper mysteries. Shara guided David through the ancient citadel, her presence a constant shadow, watching, observing, and at times reaching into the corners of his thoughts. He tried to keep his mind guarded, but it was like attempting to hold back the tide with a handful of sand. Her telepathy was subtle, but unyielding, and every moment with her felt like standing under a dissecting gaze. She led him through corridors lined with crystalline walls that pulsed with the same green glow as the planet's sky, showing him relics of her people's past. Artifacts from ages long forgotten lay in glass cases, sculptures of alien deities with many arms, crystalline objects that hummed with their own resonance, and murals that stretched across the walls, depicting the birth of the Tribunal civilization. Yet for all their splendor, The corridors felt hollow, as if their grandeur had been slowly suffocating under the weight of time and duty. David could see it in Shara's eyes whenever she looked away from him, staring into those ancient murals, as if searching for something that had been lost. One day, after weeks of silent, cautious exchanges, they arrived at a vast chamber deep beneath the citadel, a sacred place, Shara told him, where only the most trusted could tread. The chamber was dominated by a structure that rose from the center of the floor like a jagged, crystalline tree, its branches weaving together into a canopy that arched high above. Streams of blue energy flowed through its veins, filling the room with a soft, otherworldly glow. It thrummed with a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat that seemed to echo through the air, vibrating deep into David's bones. "Here, David, is where the history of our people is stored," Shara said, her voice a whisper that carried through the chamber. "It is the source of our knowledge, the memories of all who came before us." David approached the structure cautiously, reaching out to touch its cool surface. The moment his fingers brushed the crystal, a flood of images surged into his mind, visions of distant worlds, alien species, wars fought in the cold of space, and the rise of the Tribunal. He pulled back, gasping, his mind reeling from the intensity of the experience. Shara's expression softened as she watched him. "It is overwhelming, I know, but it is also a reminder of why we must survive, why we cannot afford to fade into the void like so many others." David leaned against the structure, catching his breath. "You act like you're the last of your kind, but you've got an entire council of powerful women calling the shots here. Why do you need me, Shara? Why can't you just continue as you always have?" Shara's eyes dimmed, the glow in their depths flickering like a dying ember. "You see our strength, but not our fragility. Our power, our gifts, come with a price of slow decline, a weakening that we cannot halt. Each generation grows less than the one before. It is a flaw in our very nature, one that our greatest minds have tried and failed to mend. We need new blood, David, or we will wither." Her words struck a chord of truth that resonated through him. For the first time he glimpsed the fear that lurked beneath their commanding presence, the desperation of a people who had reached the limits of their existence. It was a fear that he recognized, one he had seen in his own species' struggles back on Earth, in the fight against extinction and the yearning for a future beyond their fragile blue planet. But sympathy did not change his determination to escape. He was no savior, no willing participant in their genetic experiments. He forced himself to look away from the structure, to close off the emotions that welled up inside him. "What you're asking for," he said, his voice steadying, "it's not fair. You can't just take someone's life and twist it to fit your needs. I never asked for this, and I never will." Shara's gaze turned cold, her hands clenching at her sides. For a moment he thought she might strike him, but then her shoulders sagged, and she turned away. "You think I wanted this, David? You think I do not see what we have become? There is no fairness in survival, only the choices we are given, and the price we must pay for them." She left him alone in the chamber, the air between them thick with words unspoken. David watched her retreating form, feeling a knot twist in his chest, though he could not say why. A few days later, David encountered Zareen. Their meeting was not in a sacred chamber or a secluded corridor, but in the wide training grounds behind the citadel, a place where the air thrummed with the sound of blades clashing and the rhythmic stamp of feet against stone. Unlike Shara, Zareen was not one for delicate conversations or probing questions. Her approach was direct, like a comet streaking through the atmosphere, brilliant, fierce, and unyielding. David found her sparring with a group of tribunal guards, their bodies moving in a synchronized dance of combat. Zareen stood at the center of the fray, her skin a rich bronze, shimmering with the sweat of exertion. Her movements were swift and precise, each strike flowing into the next with the grace of a predator in its element. When she caught sight of David, she paused, dismissing her sparring partners with a sharp gesture. "So the Earthman finally shows his face," she said, her voice tinged with a mocking edge, her golden eyes fixed on him, narrowing as if she were assessing his every weakness. "I thought you would have tried to escape by now." David folded his arms, meeting her gaze with defiance. "Maybe I'm just biding my time." Zareen smirked, a feral grin that bared her teeth. "Biding your time or biding your cowardice? I've seen how you cling to your anger, but anger is useless if you don't know how to wield it." She tossed him a slender staff made of the same crystalline material as the structure in the sacred chamber. He caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it, as its weight settled in his hands. "What's this?" he asked, gripping the staff more tightly as she advanced on him, her own weapon spinning in her hands. "A chance," she replied, circling him like a wolf. "Fight me, Earthman. Show me if you have any fire in that fragile body of yours." Before he could protest, she lunged at him, the tip of her staff whistling through the air. David barely managed to raise his own weapon in time, the impact reverberating through his arms. The force of her strike drove him back, his feet slipping on the smooth stone. "Is this your idea of training?" he grunted, deflecting another blow. "Or just another way to humiliate me?" Zareen's expression remained cold, her eyes gleaming with a ruthless light. "There is no place for weakness here, David. If you want to survive, truly survive, you must learn to fight for what you want." The battle that followed was brief but brutal. David fought with everything he had, but Zareen's skill was beyond anything he had faced before. Her movements were a blur, each strike precise, each feint calculated to draw him out of balance. His muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he refused to back down. And then, just as he felt his strength giving out, he managed a wild swing that caught her off guard, grazing her arm. For a moment, their eyes met his filled with defiance, hers with a flicker of surprise. Zareen's smirk returned, though this time there was a hint of respect in it. She stepped back, lowering her staff. "Not bad, Earthman. You've got a stubborn streak, I'll give you that. But stubbornness is not enough to survive here." She turned to leave, but David's voice stopped her. "Why do you care, Zareen? You clearly don't want me here any more than I want to be here. So why waste your time?" Zareen paused, her back to him, and for a moment David thought she wouldn't answer. But then she glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Because, David, I have seen what happens to those who refuse to adapt, and I refuse to watch another soul be crushed beneath the weight of this place." With that, she left him standing alone in the training grounds, the crystalline staff clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Over the next few weeks, David found himself caught between Shara's quiet, probing presence and Zareen's demanding challenges. Shara tried to guide him through the intricacies of their culture, sharing tales of the ancient rituals and the honor codes that bound the Tribunal. She spoke of her mother's expectations, the weight of her position as the High Chancellor's daughter, and the burden of knowing that her life had been predetermined since birth. In those moments, David sensed the longing in her, an unspoken wish for a life beyond duty, a desire she could never fully voice. Zareen, on the other hand, dragged him into the physical reality of their world. She pushed him through grueling combat drills, testing his limits again and again, driving him to the point of exhaustion. Yet in those moments she seemed almost alive, her stern demeanor giving way to a fierce joy in the heat of battle. She never spoke of her past, but David saw the strain in her eyes, the pressure of being the warrior daughter, the one who must always be strong, even when the strength came at the cost of her own heart. Slowly, reluctantly, David began to understand them. He saw how the demands of the Tribunal had shaped their lives, just as it now sought to reshape his own. And though he refused to bend to their will, a part of him couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for their struggles. Yet beneath it all, his desire for freedom burned as brightly as ever. He knew that if he was going to survive this ordeal, he needed more than just an understanding of their world, he needed a plan. And as the days passed, he began to piece together the fragments of a potential escape. One night, while Shara slept in a nearby chamber, David stole away to the ruins outside the citadel. It was a dangerous move, but he was driven by a desperate hope that the ruins might hold something, anything, that could help him escape this planet. The air was cool, the green mist swirling around him as he searched through the crumbling remains of an ancient civilization. And then, hidden among the ruins, he found a small, concealed compartment within a shattered pillar, containing a device that thrummed with a faint signal, an old communication relay, dusty but intact. David's heart pounded in his chest as he brushed the dirt away, cradling the device in his hands. It was damaged, barely functional, but it might be enough. If he could get it working, he might be able to reach out beyond the Tribunal's control, to call for help, to find a way back to the stars. But as he turned the device over, testing its functions, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Shara standing there, her expression unreadable, her eyes glinting with a pale light in the darkness. "You should not be here, David," she said, her voice a soft murmur that sent a chill through his blood. But there was something in her tone and uncertainty, a hesitation that made him pause. Neither should you, he replied, clutching the relay tighter. But maybe that means we both want something more than this. Shara's gaze lingered on the device in his hands, and for a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken possibilities. David's pulse quickened, his mind racing with the implications. Did she know about his plan? Would she stop him? Or would she turn a blind eye? As the green mist curled around them, David realized that the next move in this dangerous game was his to make. But whatever choice he made, it would ripple far beyond this ruined courtyard, shaping not just his fate, but the fate of all who lived under the shadow of the Galactic Women's Tribunal. The atmosphere within the Citadel had grown tense, the air charged with unspoken secrets and barely restrained emotions. David could feel it in the way the Tribunal members moved through the halls, their telepathic whispers buzzing at the edge of his mind like distant static. He could sense it in Shara's watchful eyes, the way she seemed to hover between a desire to understand him and a duty to control him. But most of all, he felt it in himself, a growing unease that gnawed at his thoughts, an urgency that propelled him forward even as he knew the danger of being discovered. The nights had become his sanctuary, a time when he could slip away from the endless watchfulness and seek out the hidden corners of the ancient citadel. He spent hours with the damaged communication relay he had found in the ruins, working in secret beneath the cover of darkness. It was a delicate, painstaking process, repairing circuits, piecing together the alien technology with whatever tools he could smuggle from the workshops. But slowly the device began to hum with a faint, stubborn life, like a pulse beating through the void. And, with it, so did hope. One such night he was interrupted by the arrival of Iria. David was crouched in a dimly lit alcove near the edge of the Citadel's grounds, the relay in his lap glowing softly as he calibrated its frequencies. He had just managed to align the signal enough to send a short burst into the stars when a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat, and turned to see a figure standing among the shadows. Iria's presence was unlike Shara's probing silence or Zarin's brash intensity. She moved as if she were a part of the air itself, her body blending into the mist that swirled around her feet. Her hair, a cascade of silver that shimmered like the planet's distant rivers, caught the moonlight and framed her face in a halo of pale light. But it was her eyes that struck him the most, eyes that held the deep, quiet sorrow of one who had seen too much, who had carried a burden for far too long. David's grip tightened on the relay, a surge of panic surging through him. He had been so careful, so sure that no one had followed him this time. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some excuse, but Iria raised a hand, her expression serene. "You do not need to explain yourself, David," she said, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. "I know why you come here." David's mouth went dry. He shifted his weight, trying to keep his movements casual, but he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Iria's gaze softened, her lips curving into a wistful smile. "You wish to escape, to return to the stars that called you here. I sensed your presence in the ruins, just as I have sensed your dreams when you sleep. You dream of freedom, of open space, of a life beyond this place." Her words sent a chill down his spine, but there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet understanding that unnerved him more than any threat. He studied her, searching for any sign of deceit, but found only a sad sincerity in her eyes. "And you haven't told the others?" he asked, the question rough with disbelief. Iria shook her head slowly, her expression turning pensive. "No, I thought that perhaps you might succeed where others have not." David's brow furrowed, confusion mingling with a cautious hope. "What do you mean, others? Has this happened before?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the distant mountains that loomed beyond the citadel's walls. "There have been others brought here, like you. Strangers from distant worlds, chosen for their strength, their unique traits. Some resisted as you do, some even tried to escape." Her voice grew softer, her tone filled with an unspoken pain. "But none of them made it far." David felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He glanced down at the relay in his hands, suddenly aware of how fragile his hopes truly were, and what happened to them. "They were reconditioned," Iria replied, the word heavy with implication. "Their memories altered, their wills broken, until they accepted their place among us. It is a mercy in the eyes of the Tribunal." David's stomach twisted at the thought of having his mind tampered with, of losing everything that made him who he was. He had heard of such things, mind-altering technologies used as weapons or tools of control, but never in his worst nightmares had he imagined being on the receiving end. Aria's expression softened as she studied his reaction. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "That is why I have not spoken of your plans, David. Because I know what it is like to want to escape a life that has been chosen for you." David looked up at her sharply, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her tone. You want to leave too?" A shadow passed over her face, a flicker of something ancient and weary. "I was not always as you see me now. Before my powers emerged, I dreamed of exploring the stars, of seeing worlds beyond the Tribunal's reach. But my gifts bound me here, just as they have bound my sisters. We are not free, David, no matter how our people try to pretend otherwise." She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over the relay, her touch as delicate as a breath. "If you are determined to send your signal, then I will not stand in your way. But know this: if the Tribunal senses what you have done, they will not show mercy." David swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. But beneath the fear, he felt a spark of gratitude, a sense of connection with this strange, ethereal woman who had chosen, against all logic, to protect his secret. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with unspoken emotion, "for not turning me in, and for understanding." Aria's smile was fleeting, a ghost of warmth that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. "Do not thank me yet, David. Your path is still uncertain, and danger lies ahead." With that, she turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone beneath the alien sky. For a long moment, he stared after her, his mind a whirl of questions and doubts. But as he looked down at the faintly glowing relay in his hands, a new resolve settled over him. He would take the risk. He had to. The following day, David's covert actions came to a head during a session with the Tribunal. They summoned him to the Great Hall, a vast chamber filled with shifting lights that played across the crystalline walls. The air hummed with the presence of the Tribunal members, each one radiating an aura of power that pressed against his mind like a dense fog. High Chancellor Lyreth stood at the center, her expression impassive as her golden eyes bored into him. Shara and Zareen flanked her on either side, their faces carefully neutral, but he caught the tension in their stances, the way their hands clenched at their sides. "David of Earth," Lyreth began, her voice resonating through the chamber. "You have lived among us for many cycles now. You have seen our ways, learned our history. Yet still you resist the purpose for which you were brought here." David met her gaze with defiance, refusing to be cowed by the weight of her presence. "I never asked to be part of your plans. You took me against my will, and you expect me to just accept that? I'm not your puppet." Lyreth's expression remained unreadable, but he sensed a shift in the air, a subtle tightening of the psychic threads that bound the Tribunal's minds together. She gestured, and a series of images flickered to life in the air above them, holograms of David's time in the Citadel, his secret excursions to the ruins, his attempts to repair the relay. A cold dread settled over him as he realized the extent of their surveillance. They had known about his efforts all along, watched him struggle and plot, while pretending to be ignorant. "You believe yourself clever, Earthman," Lyreth said, her tone laced with icy amusement, "but your actions endanger more than yourself. By seeking to contact the outside, you risk drawing the attention of powers that would destroy all that we have built." David's hands curled into fists, anger surging through him like a wildfire. "You're the ones who brought me here. You think you can use me like some kind of tool and then blame me for wanting to leave." The air crackled with tension as Lyreth's gaze hardened. "We do what we must to ensure the survival of our people. You have no conception of the burdens we carry." Before David could respond, Shara stepped forward, her expression strained. "Mother, please. He does not understand the full consequences of his actions. Perhaps if we allowed him more time." Lyreth silenced her with a sharp gesture. "Enough, Shara. Your compassion blinds you. David's defiance cannot be tolerated." But as David braced himself for whatever punishment they intended to mete out, a new voice cut through the chamber, low and fierce, carrying a note of barely controlled anger. "David is not the only one who questions your methods, Mother." Zareen's words sent a ripple of shock through the Tribunal. She stepped forward, her stance rigid, her golden eyes blazing. "We brought him here because we believed in the strength of his genes, but if we break his spirit, what strength will remain? perhaps it is time we consider that our survival does not depend solely on control. For a moment, Lyrath's composure wavered, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face. The other tribunal members murmured among themselves, their telepathic conversations a buzz of dissonance that David could not decipher. Iria, who had been silent until now, spoke softly from the shadows. Change comes slowly to our kind, but perhaps it is time for change. David's heart pounded as he watched the struggle play out before him. He could see the fractures in the tribunal's unity, the cracks that had begun to show through their carefully crafted facade of strength. For the first time, he sensed the possibility of a different outcome, a chance that he might not only survive this encounter but shape its outcome. The tribunal session ended with an uneasy truce, a promise of reconsideration that left David with more questions than answers. As the members dispersed, he caught Shara's eye, and she gave him a small, almost apologetic nod. Zareen remained silent, her expression set in a mask of determination. But there was a glint in her gaze that suggested she had not spoken her last. Iria lingered behind, her silver hair catching the last rays of the alien sun as she approached him. "You have stirred the waters, David. But do not mistake this for victory. The currents here are deep, and they may yet pull you under." David nodded, his resolve tempered with a newfound understanding of the forces at play. "I know, but maybe it's time someone did." As he turned to leave the chamber, he felt the weight of the tribunal's gaze upon him, a reminder that his struggle for freedom had only just begun. Yet beneath the fear, a new determination had taken root, one that would drive him forward, no matter the cost. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the ancient citadel, a faint signal pulsed into the void, carrying with it the desperate hope of a man who refused to be broken. David's life in the citadel became a strange rhythm of uncertainty and discovery. The days turned into weeks, and as the threat of the tribunal's wrath loomed over him, he found himself drawn more and more to the one constant in the shifting currents of his new existence, Iria. She moved through the citadel like a ghost, a being of quiet grace, whose presence soothed the jagged edges of his fear. Where Shara's mind pressed upon his with a probing intensity, and Zareen's brash energy was like a fire that threatened to consume, Iria's presence was a cool breeze, a balm against the rawness of his isolation. At first, David fought against the attachment. He reminded himself of his mission, the fragile signal he had sent out through the damaged relay, the hope of rescue that flickered at the edge of his thoughts. But as the weeks passed and no answer came, he found it harder to maintain the distance he had tried to put between himself and this alien woman. Their meetings became more frequent, always in the hidden corners of the citadel quiet gardens where crystalline flowers bloomed under alien stars, or in shadowy alcoves where the ancient walls whispered secrets in languages long forgotten. She seemed to sense his moods with a sensitivity that bordered on the supernatural, appearing whenever his frustration grew too fierce, or when he brooded over the fate that the tribunal had thrust upon him. Her conversations, always gentle and unassuming, became a lifeline, a reminder that amidst the power struggles and cryptic rituals, there was still a core of humanity, of connection, that he could cling to. One evening they met in a garden tucked away beneath the citadel's lower levels, a place where the air shimmered with bioluminescent plants that glowed in shades of blue and violet. David had come here often since discovering it, drawn by the peace that the glowing blooms brought him. Tonight the garden was illuminated by the soft light of twin moons hanging low in the sky, their reflections rippling in a small pool at the garden center. Iria stood by the water's edge, her silhouette framed by the pale light, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. As he approached, she turned to him, offering a smile that held a trace of melancholy. "You are troubled again, David. The stars whisper your thoughts even when you try to keep them hidden." David gave a tired chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's hard to keep anything hidden here, isn't it? But yeah, I've been thinking. About what comes next." She inclined her head, her expression encouraging him to continue. He sank down beside the pool, staring at the rippling surface as he gathered his thoughts. "I sent a signal out weeks ago," he admitted, the confession leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "A distress call. I don't even know if it got through or if there's anyone out there to hear it, but I had to try. I thought maybe if I could reach someone, there'd be a chance to get out of here, to go back to my own life." Iria's gaze remained steady, but he saw the faint flicker of sadness that crossed her face. She knelt beside him, her fingers trailing through the water, leaving ripples that distorted the reflection of the moons. And yet, you are still here. Perhaps the universe has chosen to delay your answer for a reason. David scoffed, though there was no real malice in the sound. You sound like Shara, talking about fate and destiny. I never put much stock in that kind of thing. I always thought a man made his own path with his own hands. Aria's smile softened, and for a moment she looked almost wistful. I once thought that too, when I was younger, before I understood the currents that shape our lives. But sometimes the universe is more like a river than a road. We can swim against it, but there are forces beyond our control that guide us to places we never expected to go. David turned to her, studying the shadows that danced across her face. He found himself wanting to know more, to understand the woman who spoke so freely of things he had never considered. What about you, Aria? If you could go anywhere, do anything, where would you want to go? She fell silent for a long moment, her eyes turned inward, as if she were gazing into a memory too distant to reach. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. I would have left this world once. When I first realized what my powers could do, how they bound me to this place, to the tribunal I dreamed of escaping, of traveling beyond the stars to worlds where my name was unknown. But as the years passed, those dreams faded, buried beneath the weight of duty. Now I cannot even imagine what such freedom would feel like. David's chest tightened at the quiet resignation in her words, and he reached out without thinking, his hand brushing against hers where it hovered above the water. Her skin was cool, like the surface of the pool, but her fingers curled around his, holding on as if she feared the contact would slip away. You should have that chance, Aria, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You deserve to be more than what they've made you. She looked at him then, and he saw something raw and unguarded in her eyes, a glimmer of longing that mirrored his own. For a heartbeat, the distance between their worlds, their lives, seemed to collapse, leaving only the fragile thread of understanding that connected them. You speak as if it is so simple, David, she replied, her voice trembling with a faint, bitter laugh. But you and I both know that the tribunal would never allow it. My place is here, as yours is among the stars. We are like the moons of this world, forever circling but never able to touch. David's heart clenched, a sense of loss flooding through him at the thought. He tightened his grip on her hand, willing her to hear the truth in his words. Maybe we can change that. Maybe we don't have to accept what they tell us. What if we found a way out together? Aria's eyes widened, and for a moment he saw the spark of hope ignite within them. But then she withdrew, pulling her hand away, and the light faded as quickly as it had come. She rose to her feet, wrapping her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill. I cannot, David, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. If I were to betray the tribunal, if they knew I had helped you, they would turn their wrath not just on me, but on all who are dear to me. They would tear apart everything I love to ensure that no one else dared follow my path. David felt a pang of frustration, but he could not bring himself to blame her. He knew the weight of fear that held her captive, the terrible power that the tribunal wielded over those who lived under their rule. Yet, as he watched her walk away, he couldn't help but feel that they had come so close to something real, something that transcended the barriers of their species and the roles they had been forced to play. He stared down at the water, his reflection fractured by the ripples that Aria's touch had left behind. The moonlight glinted off the damaged relay in his pocket, a reminder of the risk he had taken, the hope he still clung to. And as he sat there, a decision solidified in his mind, a plan that would force the tribunal's hand and give Aria the freedom she deserved, even if it came at the cost of everything he had left. The next morning, the tribunal convened again, but this time David was the one to demand an audience. The great hall was filled with the glow of the crystal lattice, the alien light casting sharp shadows across the faces of the tribunal members. Lyrath stood at the center, her expression unreadable as David stepped forward, his resolve hardening like steel within him. I have come to make a proposal, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. You brought me here because you believed I could ensure your survival, because you thought my genes could save your people. But what if I could offer you something more? A chance to break free of the cycle that binds you, a way to ensure your legacy without turning your daughters into prisoners. A murmur rippled through the tribunal, and David saw Shara exchange a wary glance with Zarian. But Lyrath's expression remained cold and impassive. Speak plainly, David of Earth. What is it that you think you can offer us? David took a breath, knowing that the next words he spoke would set everything in motion. I sent a signal out into the void. I asked for help. And if I am allowed to go free, I will share what I've learned of your people, your strengths, your potential. Earth has technology that could stabilize your declining genes. A way to work with you as equals instead of forcing this breeding program. But if you keep me here, if you try to use me as a pawn, then you risk the wrath of whatever forces might respond to that signal. His words hung in the air, and he saw the way the tribunal members shifted uneasily, their telepathic whispers growing louder. He had struck a nerve, and he pressed on, feeling the urgency of his gamble. I don't want this to end in bloodshed. I don't want to see Aria, Shara, or Zareen suffer for your mistakes. Give me my freedom, and I'll give you the chance for a future one, where your daughters aren't trapped by your choices. Lyrath's eyes blazed, and for a moment he thought she might strike him down where he stood. But then her gaze shifted, drifting toward Aria, who had entered the chamber silently and now watched from the shadows. There was a flicker of something in the High Chancellor's expression, doubt, perhaps, or fear of the consequences that lay ahead. The silence stretched, taut and fragile as a thread, until Lyrath finally spoke. You think to threaten us, David? To bargain with powers you cannot hope to understand. Her voice was ice, but he could hear the uncertainty beneath it. Very well. You will have your chance to prove the worth of your words, but if you fail, you will face the consequences, and those who stand with you will share in your fate. David's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to nod, keeping his expression steady. He glanced toward Aria, catching her eye, and saw a glimmer of hope flicker there once more. As he was led away from the hall, he couldn't help but feel that the path ahead had narrowed into a knife's edge. One wrong step, and he would plunge into the darkness that awaited below. But for the first time since his arrival on this alien world, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense that he might yet find a way to carve a new path through the stars. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would not have to walk it alone. The days that followed were a delicate dance of preparation and hidden risks. Aria visited him often in the secluded corners of the citadel, their conversations turning from tentative confidences to a shared determination that burned brighter with each passing moment. She helped him navigate the labyrinth of tribunal politics, taught him the hidden weaknesses in their telepathic web, and shared stories of her childhood dreams that David now hoped he could make real. As the time for his final confrontation with the tribunal approached, he found himself lingering on her presence, on the warmth of her voice, on the moments of laughter they had stolen together in the midst of uncertainty. He knew that he was growing attached to her, that he had come to care for her in ways that defied the logic of their circumstances. But he also knew that every step forward was a step into the unknown, and that the threads of fate that bound them together could unravel with the slightest pull. The night before his planned departure, David and Aria met one last time in the hidden garden. The stars shone bright above them, their light reflecting in the pools as the bioluminescent blooms cast a soft glow over the scene. They sat together by the water's edge, their shoulders brushing, their hands intertwined. Aria's head rested against his shoulder, and for a moment, the chaos of their lives seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their breathing, the cool night air, and the promise of a future that seemed so close, and yet so fragile. If we succeed tomorrow, Aria whispered, her voice barely audible, what will you do, David? Will you leave this world behind, leave me behind, to return to your stars? David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He thought of Earth, of the life he had once known, of the endless expanse of space that had always felt like his true home. But when he opened his eyes, he looked not at the sky, but at Aria, the woman who had become the anchor in this strange, alien world. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough with the truth. But if I do leave, I want you to come with me. I want you to see those stars, to have the freedom you deserve. Aria's fingers tightened around his, and he felt the shudder of her breath as she fought back tears. Do not make promises that cannot be kept, David. But thank you for giving me something to believe in again. They sat together until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting the citadel in a pale, silvery glow. And as they parted, David knew that whatever happened next, his life and hers would never be the same. The morning of the tribunal's decision arrived with a tension that crackled through the air. The great hall was filled with members of the tribunal, their expressions guarded as they awaited David's proposal. He stood before them, the relay hidden beneath his robes, the weight of his gamble pressing heavily on his shoulders. But he was not alone. Arya stood beside him, her presence a quiet strength that steadied his resolve. And as the Tribunal's eyes bore into him, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next, ready to challenge their control, to fight for a future that neither of them had thought possible. And in that moment, as the dawn broke over the alien world, David understood that his fate was no longer just his own, it was intertwined with Arya's, bound together by a thread of hope that would carry them both into whatever lay beyond. The day of the Tribunal's decision dawned with a quiet tension that seeped through the citadel's crystalline walls. The air hummed with the resonance of unspoken thoughts, and the green skies above churned with low clouds, casting a strange light over the assembly hall. David stood at the center of the chamber, his mind steady, but his heart thrumming with the weight of the choices he had made. He knew that his next words would shape not only his future, but the fate of Arya and the entire Tribunal. The members of the Tribunal, led by Lyrath, were seated in a half-circle around him, their expressions guarded. Shara stood to the right, her hands clasped before her as she watched David with an unreadable gaze. Zareen stood to the left, her warrior's stance as unyielding as ever, but her eyes flicked to David with something that might have been hope. And behind them, Arya lingered at the edge of the light, her presence a shadow that lent him strength. Lyrath's voice broke the silence, each word precise, cutting through the tension like a blade. David of Earth, you have asked for a chance to speak, to propose a new path forward, but remember that our patience is not endless. Choose your words with care. David nodded, taking a breath to steady himself. He glanced at Arya, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to push him forward, enough to remind him why he was standing here. I understand the urgency of your situation, he began, his voice carrying through the vast chamber. And I understand why you brought me here, why you believed that my genes, my resilience might be the answer to your survival. But I am not a tool. I am a person, with my own choices, my own desires. And I believe there is a way for both of us to get what we want. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as the Tribunal members exchanged telepathic murmurs. Lyrath's expression remained impassive, but David could see the tightening around her eyes, the subtle shift of tension in her posture. You seek continuity for your people, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled women. A future where your daughters are not trapped by the decline of your powers. And I am willing to help you achieve that, but on my terms. Lyrath's eyes narrowed, her golden irises glinting in the pale light. What terms, Earthman? Speak plainly. David took another breath, feeling the weight of his next words pressing down on him. I will agree to your plan to contribute my genes, to help your people continue. But I will only do so with one of your daughters, with Arya. A murmur of shock rippled through the chamber, the Tribunal members exchanging glances, their surprise echoing through the telepathic currents that David could feel even from a distance. Shara's expression tightened, her hands clenching at her sides, while Zareen's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. Lyrath's gaze turned sharply to Arya, who stepped forward from the shadows, her face composed but her eyes filled with a quiet determination. Do you accept this condition? Arya the High Chancellor asked, her tone laden with an authority that brooked no dissent. Arya met her mother's gaze, and David saw the flash of defiance that burned in her eyes. Yes, I do. David has chosen, and so have I. The air grew taut, the tension vibrating between them like a drawn bowstring. For a long moment, it seemed as if Lyrath might refuse, might lash out in anger at the audacity of their request. But then she closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with a reluctant acceptance. Very well, David of Earth. If this is your wish, then so be it. You will bond with Arya, and together, you will ensure the future of our people. But know this: should you betray this trust, the consequences will be severe. David held her gaze, unflinching. I understand. As the Tribunal dissolved into murmurs and debates, Arya moved to his side, her hand brushing against his, her touch warm and reassuring. He looked down at her, and for a moment, the chaos of the chamber seemed to fade away, leaving only the connection between them, a fragile, precious thread that had grown stronger with every secret, every whispered conversation in the shadows. And though the path before them was uncertain, David felt a sense of rightness settle over him, a sense that, whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed saw David and Aria's bond deepen in ways he had never expected. The Tribunal assigned them a private suite within the Citadel, a space far removed from the formal quarters David had been given upon his arrival. Here, amidst the crystalline architecture and the quiet hum of alien energy, they found a sanctuary from the watchful eyes of the other council members. Aria became his guide in ways beyond the surface of their shared goal. She taught him the intricacies of her culture, the meanings behind the symbols etched into the Citadel's walls, the songs that the winds carried over the mountains at night. They would sit together in the evenings, listening to the strange music of the alien flora that bloomed beneath the twin moons, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. For David, these moments became an anchor or reminder of the life he had once known, but also of the new life that was unfolding before him. He found himself laughing more easily, sharing stories of Earth, of the places he had seen, the stars he had charted. And Aria, in turn, spoke of the hidden beauty of her world, the way the rivers flowed with silver light, the memories of a childhood spent exploring the Citadel's forgotten corners. One evening, as they sat together on a balcony overlooking the Citadel's glowing landscape, David reached out, his hand brushing a lock of silver hair from Aria's face. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the moonlight, and for a moment the distance between their worlds seemed to vanish entirely. "You've changed me, you know," he said softly, his voice barely more than a breath. "When I first came here, all I could think about was escaping. But now, I can't imagine leaving you behind." Aria's lips curved into a gentle smile, and she leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. "And you have shown me a world beyond these walls, David. A world where I am more than the role I was given." They stayed like that for a long time, the night air cool against their skin, the stars wheeling above them in their slow, eternal dance. And as the warmth of Aria's presence seeped into him, David felt a certainty settle deep within his chest, a certainty that this, whatever it was between them, was real. One night, that connection deepened into something physical, something that went beyond words and promises. They had spent the evening in their suite, sharing a quiet dinner as the alien skies shifted through shades of violet and gold. Aria had been more reserved than usual, her thoughts distant, her expression tinged with a sadness that David could not quite place. After a time, she turned to him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his cheek. "David, there is something I must ask you. Something I fear I have no right to ask." David's breath caught at the vulnerability in her voice, and he covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face. "You can ask me anything, Aria, you know that." She met his gaze, and he saw the shadows of 1,000 unspoken fears in her eyes. "Are you certain about this? About us? The path we have chosen is not an easy one, and I do not wish to see you suffer for my sake." He shook his head, his voice firm with conviction. "I am certain, Aria. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Her expression softened, and for a moment she simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to commit every detail to memory. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was as tentative as it was electric. David's breath caught, and for an instant he froze, his mind reeling with the realization of how much he had come to care for this woman, this alien who had been his captor, and had become so much more. But then his hands moved of their own accord, sliding into her hair, pulling her closer as he deepened the kiss. Aria responded with a hunger that mirrored his own, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her body pressing against his. The tension between them, built up over weeks of stolen moments and whispered confidences, broke like a dam, spilling over into a flood of need and desire. They moved together through the shadows of their suite, shedding the last barriers that separated them. David's hands traced the contours of Aria's body, marveling at the warmth of her skin, the way she shivered beneath his touch. Her breath came in soft, broken gasps, her fingers digging into his shoulders, as if she feared he might disappear if she let go. And when they finally sank onto the bed, their bodies twining together in the darkness, it felt like the world outside had faded away, leaving only the heat of their shared,